such a bunch of musicologists, I would need to throw them a curveball and take them by surprise, talk to them about something about which they normally do not talk in public. So I thought, what about a little Clausewitz? I'm going to ask Professor Girard to talk to us about his book, Achever Clausewitz, which he wrote along with Benoît Change, who is not with us at this time. And you'll be delighted to hear the English translation and edition of which will be made available through Michigan State University Press, probably around the turn of the year, December, January. So if I may now hand over to Professor Dupuy.
So the question is, why Clausewitz? Well, the first reason is that Clausewitz is an incredible character from the point of view of the dynamic theory. I'm thinking about his relationship to Napoleon. And he's probably the man in all of history who talked most eloquently against Napoleon and for Napoleon at the same time. He was passionately in love with the career of Napoleon. Then he felt that the 18th century had committed a great crime, which was to damage war itself. That maybe war would not recover from the 18th century, from what the French call la guerre andante, war with laces, lace and he felt that war was being rejected by the people. In other words, he was afraid of what everybody wanted at the time and still want, which was the end of war. And curiously, he's an essentialist. He felt that the extinction of war would be a catastrophe for mankind, but certainly for the specialists of war. And therefore he was extremely grateful to Napoleon for restoring war. And very often in his book he warns that after Napoleon there is a danger that war might relapse into that kind of lethargy which was characteristic of the 18th century. Therefore, the ambivalence of his relationship to Napoleon is such, and you never read about it because Clausewitz is regarded, rightly so, as the man who wrote the greatest book on war there ever was. And they look at the content from a purely technique of war, and never the psychology of Clausewitz is mentioned in discussions about it. And the book I had read, which is a fascinating book, and a very touching book, and in my view very false, was the book of Raymond Aron. Raymond Aron, his last, the French political scientist, a very modern man, who was the dean of political studies in France for many years. And he wrote that huge book about which was his last course, very close to the end. And in that book, he's thinking all the time about the atomic bomb. And in other words, he reads secretly, quite convincingly, Clausewitz, not in the manner I just described, which is Clausewitz's own fear that war was at an end, but the reverse. If war is going to go on endlessly, if war has been revived by Napoleon, as claimed by Clausewitz, what is going to happen now with the Iron Bomb? So instead of writing a book on Clausewitz, he wrote a huge book on dissuasion, trying to prove that dissuasion would work. Deterrence, yeah. And I think this book is not convincing at all, especially if you compare it to Clausewitz himself. That, in other words, I was optimistic for mankind and for peace. But he had a lot of trouble doing it, you can see. Because it was, he wrote it in the 70s.
Yeah, 1972.
You see a period when the Cold War was at its most still intense. Well, less intense. But anyway, he looked for arguments in order to demonstrate that dissuasion would keep working. And there is a tendency for us to forget about Clausewitz in the course. And there is no consideration of Clausewitz the man. Clausewitz is the arch-Prussian. But I don't say that in a negative, French way. Clausewitz is a man who is fascinated by his own military métier. You know, in Clausewitz, he belonged to the German, to the Prussian aristocracy, but his birth was questionable and so forth. But he had some very powerful friends. And he always was an important man, politically and militarily, even though he did something which was unforgivable at the time. When Napoleon, in 1806, at the Battle of Vienna and earthquake, in 2 hours, destroyed Russia. He was such a patriot that he went to Russia. He enlisted in the army which was going to defeat Napoleon in Moscow. But the Prussian king, who was a king in the old way, in the old style, signed a treaty of peace with Napoleon. He had been defeated. And of course, his army followed him and became an ally of Napoleon. And the Prussians had more than 20,000 men invading Russia with the French. So when Clausewitz came back, you know, to Prussia, you would believe he would have greeted it as the triumphant man who was on the winning side and who had trusted his country. But no, it was, he was mistreated, obviously. He was put away and made director of the military school. And I feel he was a little bit scapegoated by his colleagues because he had been on the right side from the Prussian, which is absolutely amazing. In a way, the army works a little bit like the university. You have to do the right things. It's not important to find something true or to be ahead of people. You're talking about the future, but you have to do the same thing as your colleagues, or they don't like you. And all his life, he was a very melancholy man, you know, and spent his life writing this book with the help of his wife who published it because he died in 1850, still quite young. And it's a very powerful book, not only because of what it says about war, which is still important today. I mean, people read Clausewitz. And his name is a legend. But also, I think it's important to read this person. You can read part of his personal story between the lines. And it's very important, I think, too, for the Franco-German relations, to be able today to understand the kind of fanatic of the Prussian war like Clausewitz with the sympathy that he deserved, being the way he was, educated as he was, and so forth. So I just wanted to write an essay on Clausewitz.